Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today I have a fun hand from early in the $10,000 buy-in Seminole Hard Rock Poker Open event. This tournament is generally somewhat soft for a $10,000 buy-in tournament, but at the same time, most $10,000 buy-in tournaments are relatively tough, so we're going to get after it a bit for the most part. I'm a pretty big fan early in the tournament of playing as many hands as reasonably possible. I'm not saying to play all sorts of garbage, but if I can play aggressively, get an aggressive image, maybe win some hands, maybe even lose some hands, I think that's going to typically work out later so that it allows you to get paid off a little bit more whenever you actually do make a strong hand. So this is a prime example of this. Very first hand, I open with King 10 offsuit. Yeah, not the best hand in the world, but we're going to open it pretty much every time. We get 3-bet by a loose aggressive kid to 1,500 out of our 35,000 effective stack. And at this point, I think we have a very clear fold or 4-bet. I think calling in this spot, even in position, is going to be a big losing play, and that's a mistake a lot of amateur players make. When you call, what's going to happen is you're often just going to miss the flop, your opponent's going to bet, and you're going to fold. And that's not really what you want to have happen. Instead, you want to be the one applying aggression so that when your opponent misses, they're going to check, you're going to bet, and they're going to fold. So this is a pretty nice spot to get out of line. If I had King Jack or Ace 10 or maybe Queen Jack, I'd probably also go ahead and put in the 4-bet. I'm probably going to be calling in this position a lot of the time with the suited type hands. Just because we are relatively deep. Anytime you're playing very deep, it's usually fine to call with some of the reasonable suited hands and the best big card hands. But with the worst big card hands, like this hand, they are reasonable bluffing candidates. And we are bluffing. I don't want to make that clear. If our opponent does 5-bet us to really any amount, if he min 5 bets, we're just going to fold. We're going to be done with it. So I like this play, and I think it's perfectly fine. And the opponent decides to call, which... that's going to happen. It's not like we're just automatically done with the hand. Flop comes Jack 5-4, and now our opponent checks. This is a situation where most of the time the pre-flop raiser or 4-better, in this case, is going to have a range advantage, meaning that he is going to have more potential strong hands in his range than his opponents. Now, at the same time, I also have a range that does not really contain pocket 5s or 4s, whereas there's some small chance my opponent could have 5s or 4s. So I actually have fewer potential nut combinations than my opponent, but I do have hands like aces and jacks and stuff like that that are just very, very strong, and I can certainly bet them for value, and I'm not really concerned with being outdrawn, right? So when that is the case, when you should have lots of very strong hands in your range, you typically want to make a somewhat small bet. And actually, if you think about the range I just told you that I was 4-betting with, the best hands, which all connect reasonably well with this besides ace king and ace queen, but they still have some outs. And then also ace 10, king jack, and queen jack are the other hands I specifically named. The jack's on the board. So this is actually a reasonable flop for those as well, where they make a pretty strong hand. Now, I may check back with a hand like queen jack if I did 4-bet it, because it is a marginal made hand to some extent, and typically you want to be betting with your best made hands and your draws, and here there aren't really very many draws, so you look for other candidates, and that would be hands like king 10 offsuit. So it's a pretty cool spot where I think we definitely need to bet, and I may actually bet in the spot with everything. It's either bet with everything for very small or bet with almost everything very small. And the hands that we're checking are usually going to be hands that are good if a little bit of money goes into the pot, but not if a lot of money goes in the pot. Like if you have queen jack and you bet the flop, bet the turn, and bet the river, well, if you get called on all 3 streets, you're probably behind. So that's a hand that's usually good for 1 or 2 streets of value. With our exact hand, king 10 offsuit, though, we are obviously bluffing. So we do bet 3,600, and our opponent calls. As expected, when you bet 1/3 pot, your opponent's going to call a huge portion of the time. So don't be so concerned when that happens. Turn is a 2, so Jack 5-4 2, and now we still have nothing. And we have to decide if we should go for it or not. Now, I just mentioned that if you have a very bad hand, it's quite often fine just to completely get out of the way and give up. And at this point, if you think about our range, we have a pretty good amount of decent hands to check behind with on the turn. If we bet the flop with ace 10 or ace queen or ace king, or maybe even a hand like ace jack. These are all reasonable checking behind hands on the turn. So when I keep betting on the turn, that's usually going to be with hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks. And then what else, right? I mean, what bluffs do we have in our range? And if we have what I just listed there, we really don't have any bluffs at all. And remember I mentioned I said I'd check back perhaps king jack and queen jack on the flop. So that means my only real bluffs are potentially ace 10, which, sure, you can bluff with that. Or it's going to be hands like king 10 or maybe queen 10 if we had that. Now, of course, king 10 and queen 10 are quite bad hands at this point. They don't really have a ton of equity. But if you're playing against a strong player who you want to be somewhat balanced against, you can't just only bet with your best hands here. And fairly similar to what we had on the flop, when I bet the flop and the turn, I'm going to be betting with all of my best hands, and we want to have some bluffs. And it's kind of hard to come up with very many bluffs in this situation, especially if you want to check back ace king and ace queen on the turn, which I think you probably do, just because they have a decent amount of equity and you really don't want to get check raised off of them. Here, if I get check raised, I just fold, right? Because I have nothing. So I like this bet, although it certainly feels dirty. You want to always ask yourself as well, am I going to be bluffing the river on various runouts if my opponent check calls my turn bet? Notice the pot will go up to about 26,000 and he'll have about 18,000 behind or 19,000 behind. If my opponent checks the river, I'm going to be going all in a decent amount of the time with the aces and the kings and the jacks for sure. Queens, maybe we check sometimes. Ace jack, maybe we check sometimes, depending on the read we get on our opponent. But it's an interesting spot for sure, and I do think we need to be bluffing sometimes. When you're choosing your bluffing hand, you typically want to pick hands that block the calling hands that your opponent could have. So what calling hands could our opponent have here? Well, clearly aces, kings, and queens, right? Aces, kings, queens, and jacks. If we have a jack in our hand, though, we don't really need to be bluffing. So really we want to be bluffing in this spot with the hands like perhaps king something, queen something, or ace something. But again, we want to check back the ace, king, ace, queen on the turn. So that leaves ace 10, and it leaves king 10, and it leaves queen 10 if we have it. So these actually are reasonable bluffing hands. You just have to make sure you're not bluffing with too many of them, which is often a legitimate concern whenever you are four-betting the offsuit hands to start with. So anyway, on the turn we bet 5,000. We already have a river plan. We're probably going for it, but this time we don't even get the chance. Our opponent just folds, and we win the pot. So I know I went a little bit deep on range analysis in this hand, and hopefully that's okay with you all. If you were perhaps a little bit lost in this hand, where we're discussing not just how to play our exact hand, but our whole range, definitely check out my new book, Mastering Small Stakes No Limit Hold'em. You can get it at jonathanlittlepoker.com/mastering. There we go through a ton of examples. The book's about 480 pages long, and it has over 230 range charts in it. So check it out if you have any desire to learn how to think in a fundamentally sound way and then adjust those strategies to take advantage of the players you're likely to encounter in the small stakes games. Check out Mastering Small Stakes No Limit Hold'em. I think that will be very beneficial, and hopefully then you will better understand some of these spots that we are discussing, where we're really discussing how to play our whole range and not just our hand, because something that plagues a lot of players is they think, okay, how do I play my hand? How do I play my king 10 offsuit here? But really you want to ask, how do I play my hand, thinking about my entire range? Because if you're playing against strong players, you simply must have some amount of balance. If you're only betting with the nuts in certain spots or only betting with bluffs in certain spots, your good opponents are just going to take advantage of you. And that's what we are trying to avoid here. We want to be difficult to play against, and we want to be able to adjust to take advantage of our opponent's mistakes. So that's what you'll learn in Mastering Small Stakes No Limit Hold'em. Thank you very much for being here this week. Next time, we will be going through another bluff early in the $10,000 buy-in tournament, and maybe it won't go so well. We'll see. Thanks for watching.